Ken or Lori, if you can play now.
Shabbat Shalom, everyone. We begin with the words of a wordless melody, a nigun. Lai, 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 lai. Please join me. Yai, dai, dai, dai. Yai, dai, 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 dai. Yai, dai, yai, dai, dai, dai. Yai, dai, 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 dai. Yai, dai, dai, dai. Yai, dai, dai, dai. Yai, dai, dai, dai. Tovu manahim shevet achim gam yachad. Hine ma tovu manahim shevet achim gam yachad. Hine ma tovu manahim shevet achim gam yachad. Hine ma tovu manahim shevet achim gam yachad. Join me. Hine ma tovu manahim shevet achim gam yachad. Hine ma tovu manahim shevet achim gam yachad.
Shabbat Shalom. When tour guides in Israel trained for many years to guide Israel, there was one master teacher, and his name was Rabbi Lee Diamond. He just passed away last year. But he told the tour guides when he was training them something that would make their jobs obsolete. He said, if a kid was just dropped in Israel for a summer, instead of coming on one of our summer tours, they would have an amazing month in Israel. Because Israel is that kind of country where you could just wander wherever things take you, and things could be wonderful. The people are friendly, the sites are clearly marked, the history is potent, and history and danger unfold daily. And he told them that to make sure they understood that as important as they thought their jobs were, could be obsolete if someone was just dropped in Israel. In the same way, I have in my hands at home, it's so strange to have this at home, something that normally sits in our ark, or banjo Torah, or bandolin Torah, as we call it, which is something that also I could just show to you, and you could, in your head, without me uttering a word, figure out many things. You could figure out that something is wrong, that a Torah was cut up to repair the drum head of this bandolin. You can marvel that it's an instrument, and normally it's not at my house, but it's in our ark at Temple Bethel. And a special shelf was built when Rabbi Singer had this become part of the synagogue, taken out of an exhibition of Holocaust artifacts. And you don't really need me for much. But if you know a little bit more, In the same way, while it's fine to drop someone in Israel for a month and just let them wander, if you have a good tour guide who teaches them a little bit about the Holy Land, you'll learn a little bit more. And so if you know a little bit more and want to know a little bit more, you'll see that the word Israel is prominent in the Banjo Torah. It jumps out at you. And even if you know minimal Hebrew, and some of you know maximum Hebrew, thanks to Cantor Lori's Months of Hebrew class, you can look at the word Yisrael and say, oh, there's a word I actually recognize. But if you know a little bit more, and those were the tour guides that Lee Diamond tried to train, the ones who knew so much that you could get to any site and sense what your group wanted and needed and give it to them. Sometimes they needed a little, sometimes they needed a lot. And when you gave a lot, in the same way, if you know even more about the portion, which is this week's portion by Yishlach, this Banjo Torah, you are heartbroken. You are not just heartbroken because you know that this is a remnant of a bandolin factory that Nazis used to manufacture about 80 of these Banjo Torahs, to destroy Torahs and give their stamp to the end of the Jewish people. But if you know Hebrew well, or you know your Torah well, and can read more than that word Yisrael, all of a sudden you realize the section that is right before that word Israel is horrible. Two terrible things have happened. One, Jacob's wife Rachel has died in childbirth. And the other terrible thing that happens towards here at the bottom is one of his sons sleeps with one of his concubines. It's so disturbing and awful, but it lets us understand. And so on this Shabbat, when we know that it is the portion in this Banjo Torah and we reflect upon it, we ask ourselves this question: is it okay to know a little bit, or is it better to learn more, to learn other perspectives, to learn deeper meanings of things? And that is the point of this Shabbat. It is the point of the Torah portion where you have Jacob and Esau, who were so different and had such tension between them, and in this portion reunite because they know each other on a deeper, better level, and they have been through so much. And on this night, when we're blessed to have Dr. Robert Watson with us from Lynn University to look back at a month ago on our election and look forward, to know more, to know perspectives, to know insights, it is better. And so on this Shabbat of looking back and looking forward, there is a third element that is unsaid: looking at what our tradition has to offer and how the more we know helps us understand our Torah, our synagogue, our community, and our world better. Shabbat Shalom. It is a pleasure this evening to continue with candle lighting and Kiddush for Shabbat, and we invite forward to do that at this time, Aileen Fisher.
Shabbat Shalom. As these Shabbat candles give light to all who behold them, so may we, by our lives, give light to all who behold us. As their brightness reminds us of the generations of Israel who have kindled light, so may we, in our own day, be among those who kindle light. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech ha'olam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu lahadlik ner shel Shabbat. Amen. The heaven and the earth were finished and all their array. On the seventh day, God finished the work that God had been doing, and God ceased on the seventh day from all the work that God had done. And God blessed the seventh day and declared it holy, because on it, God ceased from all the work of creation that God had done. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, barei pori hagafen. Amen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav, v'ritzavanu, v'shabbat kodsho, v'ahava uvratzon in hilanu, zikaron l'maaseh v'reshit, ki hu yom Tequila, lil mikroe kodesh, zecher litziat mitzrayim, kivanu voka harta, yotanu kidashta, mikamim, v'shabbat kodshaka, v'ahava uvrotzon, in chaltanu. Baruch atah Adonai Mekadesh HaShabbat. Amen. L'chaim.
L'chaim. It is so beautifully appropriate that we sing Shalom Aleichem tonight. Peace be on you. In these times, in these days, it is peace that we need more than anything. We need peace for our souls. We need peace for our world. We need peace to go forward in beauty. And so it is with the words of Shalom Aleichem that we take the peace that is finally found between these two dueling brothers of Jacob and Esau and embrace it and love it and go forward with it. Shalom Aleichem.
Shalom Aleichem, Malachei HaSharet, Malachei Elyon, Mi Melech Malchei HaMlachim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Olachem L'Shalom, Malachei HaSharet, Malachei HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Baruchuni L'Shalom, Malachei HaShalom, Malachei Elyon, Mi Melech Malchei HaMlachim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Tzedchem L'Shalom, Malachei HaShalom, Malachei Elyon, Mi Melech Malchei HaMlachim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And if you are able, please rise for the Baruch Hu. Ya la 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 la, ya la 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 la, ya la 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 la, la 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 la, ya 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 la 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 la. Baruch Hu et Adonai HaMevorach, Baruch Adonai HaMevorach, Le'olam va'ed, Le'olam va'ed. Elalai, lalai, elalai, lalai, elalai, lalai, elalai, lalai, elalai, lalai, elalai, lalai, elalai, lalai. Please be seated.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher bidvaro ma'ariv aravim, v'chokhma poteach she'arim, u'bitvuna mishane itim, ומחליף את הזמנים, ומסדר את הכוכבים במשמרותיהם ברקיע כרצונו, בורא יום ולילה, גולל אור מפני חושך, וחושך מפני אור.
ומעביר יום ומביא לילה, ומבדיל בין יום ובין לילה, אדוני צבאות שמו, אל חי וקיים. תמיד ימלוך עלינו לעולם ועד, ברוך אתה אדוני, המעריב ערבים. אהבת עולם בית ישראל, עמך אהבת, תורה ומצוות, חוקים ומשפטים, אותנו לימדת, אותנו לימדת. על כן אדוני אלוהינו, בשוכבנו ובקומנו, נשיח בחוקיך, נשיח בחוקיך, ונשמח בדברי תורתך ובמצוותיך, לעולם ועד, לעולם ועד, כי הם חיינו ואורך ימינו, ובהם נגן יומם ולילה, ואהבתך תסיר ממנו לעולמים. ברוך אתה אדוני, אוהב עמו ישראל. Please rise. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, Baruch Shem Kevod Malchuto, Leolam Vaed. Please be seated.
It's my privilege to welcome our bar mitzvah, Seth Kaplan, and his parents, David and Melanie, to lead us in the V'ahavta.
ואהבת את אדוני אלוהיך בכל לבבך ובכל נפשך ובכל מאודיך. והיו הדברים האלה אשר אנוכי מצווך היום על לבביך, ושיננתם לבניך ודיברת בם בשבתך בביתך ובלכתך בדרך ובשופך ובקומך, וקשרתם לאות על ידיך, והיו לטוטפות בין עיניך, וכתבתם על מזוזות ביתך ובשעריך, למען תזכרו ועשיתם את כל מצוותיי, והייתם קדושים לאלוהיהם. אני אדוני אלוהיכם, אשר הוצאתי אתכם בארץ מצרים, להיות לכם לאלוהים. אני אדוני אלוהיכם.
And you shall love Adonai your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. And these words which I command you on this day shall be in your heart. And you shall teach them diligently to your children. And you shall speak of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, and when you lie down.
And when you rise up, and you shall bind them for a sign upon your hands, and they shall be for frontlets between your eyes. And you shall write them on the doorposts of your house and upon your gates, that you may remember and do all of my commandments, and be holy unto your God. I, Adonai, am your God, who led you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. I, Adonai, am your God.
Thank you, Seth, and everybody. Look forward to celebrating with you tomorrow afternoon. In last week's Torah portion, when Jacob was journeying away from home towards the land of Haran to find his destiny, he finds himself all alone. And in that moment of loneliness, where he is all alone, he finds that he is not alone. He finds that God is right there with him, even though he was completely unaware. And in this week's Torah portion, as Jacob is returning back to his homeland, after he prepares to meet his brother and divides his family and puts them on the other side of the river, he again finds himself alone. And yet he is not alone. For a man, an ish, an angel, or even God wrestles with him all the way till the morning. And then what happens is the angel cannot overcome Jacob and asks to be released. But Jacob says, not until you bless me. And so Jacob's name becomes Yisrael, one who wrestles with God. We, in these last months, have found ourselves alone a lot. And in those moments of loneliness, we sometimes wonder if we are really alone. And yet Abraham Joshua Heschel teaches us that there is only one way to define the Jewish religion. It is the awareness of God's interest in humanity, the awareness of a covenant, of a relationship, of a responsibility that relies on God as well as with us. Rabbi Heschel said, life is a partnership of God and humanity. God is not detached from or indifferent to our joys and griefs, but God is invested in us, in who we are and what we become and what we fashion and in how we will each choose to be God's partner in healing all that is broken in our world. Sometimes we find that loneliness is scary, but sometimes we find when we are quiet and alone and we can shut out all of the noise from our relationships, from technology, from all that besets our minds and our senses, that those moments where we are alone, we can discover our true, most authentic selves. In those moments where we are alone, we can discover not only who we are authentically, but how God is so much a part of what we are. That no matter where we are never alone. That God's holiness surrounds us in every moment. That God's presence fills our beings with light and with purpose and with understanding and with holiness. When we realize, even in our loneliness, that we are not really alone, that God is our inexorable partner from which we can never be separated, we can be relieved from our loneliness, and we can find a path towards freeing ourselves from fear and finding our way with God to journey towards a promised land of peace.
מי כמוך באלים אדוני, מי כמוך נהדר בקודש, נורא תהילות עושה פלא, מי כמוך באלים אדוני, מי כמוך נהדר בקודש. ונאמר כי פדה אדוני את יעקב וגאלו מיד חזק ממנו, ברוך אתה אדוני גאל ישראל.
Let there be love and understanding among us. Let peace and friendship be our shelter from life's storms. Let understanding among us. Let peace and friendship be our shelter from life's storms. Ashkeveinu, Adonai Eloheinu. Ashkeveinu, Leshalom. V'hamidenu, Shomreinu L'chaim. Ufros Aleinu, Sukat Shlomecha. Ashkeveinu, Adonai Eloheinu, Leshalom, Leshalom. Ashkeveinu, love and understanding among us. Ashkeveinu, peace and friendship be our shelter from life's storms. Let there be love and understanding among us. Let peace and friendship be our shelter from life's storms. Let there be love and understanding among us. Let peace and friendship be our shelter from life's storms.
It's interesting in tradition that we are commanded to observe Shabbat. You would think that this would be something instinctive, that we would want to have that day of rest. And yet we need to be told to free ourselves from all that binds us to the busyness of the workday week. That we need to be reminded, in fact, commanded to set aside those cares, to know that we'll be okay for 24 hours if we just give ourselves that holy release, that opportunity to set aside our worries and our anguish and to embrace the love and the joy and the wholeness and the peace of Shabbat.
ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת, לעשות את השבת לדורתם ברית עולם. ביני ובין בני ישראל, אותי לעולם, אותי לעולם. ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת, לעשות את השבת לדורתם ברית עולם. כי ששת ימים עשה אדוני את השמיים ואת הארץ. ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת, לעשות את השבת לדורתם ברית עולם. וביום השביעי,
וביום השביעי,
שבת וינפש,
שבת וינפש,
שבת וינפש. ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת, לעשות את השבת לדורתם ברית עולם.
Before we move into the Amidah, I just want to thank everyone who last week reached out to Rabbi Levin to make sure that he was well and healthy, that he wasn't, because he wasn't there last week to sing those words of Vashamru. I hope that serving as his understudy in that moment was satisfactory to everyone. And last week during Thanksgiving and Shabbat, Rabbi Levin has and continues to be well and healthy, but he would be too humble to offer his gratitude to everyone. But in that sense of gratitude for our blessings, let us rise now for the Amidah as we stand before the Holy One to offer our own gratitude for our own blessings.
Adonai, sefotay tiftachu fi yagid tehilatecha. Adonai, open up my lips that my mouth may declare your praise. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu, Elohei avotenu v'imotenu, Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov, Elohei Sarah, Elohei Rivka, Elohei Rachel, Elohei Leah, Ha'el Hagadol, Hagibor v'Hanora, El Elyon, Gomel Chasadim Tovim, V'konei Hakol, V'zocher Chasdei Avot v'Imahot, U'mevii Geulah Livnei v'Nehem, Lema'an Shemo be'ahava, Melech Ozer u'Moshia u'Magen. Baruch atah Adonai Magin Avraham ve'ezrat Sarah. Atah gibor le'olam Adonai mechayeh hakol atarav lehoshia. Mashiv haruach u'morid hagashem. Mechakel chayim bechesed. Mechayeh hakol berachamim rabim, somech noflim verofeh cholim, umatir asurim, umekayem emunato lishenei afar. Micha mocha ba'gevurot, umido melach, melech meimit umechayeh, umatzmiach Yeshua, v'ne'eman atah lahachayot hakol. Baruch atah Adonai mechayeh hakol. אתה קדוש ושמך קדוש, וקדושים בכל יום יהללוך סלה. ברוך אתה אדוני האל הקדוש.
Please be seated. The theme this evening of our worship is looking back, looking forward. When we do that, when we think about where we have come from, where we have been, and where we wish to go, it prompts us to look around and think, what has been good for me? What has been not so good for me? What is it that I wish to offer a sense of thankfulness and gratitude for? Last week, we of course celebrated Thanksgiving, but as we discussed in services in the past few weeks, the giving of thanks is not an annual event for the Jewish people. It is a daily event. It is a thrice daily event. Each time we say the Amidah during the week and on Shabbat, during the festivals and even the high holy days, we say the words of Modim, where we say to God, we are grateful. We are grateful for the gifts that we have been given. We are grateful for having been put on this earth to live our lives. We have been grateful for the opportunity to make this world a better place. And so as we take a few moments now for silent prayer and meditation, we will conclude those moments of personal prayer with the singing of the words of Modim, our prayer for gratitude.
Atahu Adonai Eloheinu Ve'Elohei Avoteinu Ve'imotenu Le'olam Va'ed Zor Chayenu Magen Yeshenu Atahu Lidor Vador Zor Chayenu Magen Yeshenu Atahu Lidor Vador Shalom Rav Yisrael Amcha Tasim Leolam Ki Ata Hu Melech Adon Hu Melech Adon Lechol HaShalom.
We have the privilege tonight of celebrating some wonderful milestone birthdays. First for Spencer Krieger and also for Franchi Lavi, who we are so excited to celebrate with. We hope that these milestone birthdays that each of you are celebrating tonight will help you to spend some time thinking about the road of life that has led you to this moment, to think back on all that you have fashioned and achieved in the course of your life's journey, all of the love that you have shared with family and with friends along that way. And we pray that this celebration of life will help you to count those blessings and to realize, God willing, for many, many, many years, good health, lots of love and joy and peace. And let's all sing together, happy, happy birthday.
Yom Huledet Sameach, Yom Huledet Sameach, Yom Huledet Sameach, Yom Huledet Sameach. Happy birthday.
They can hear us now.
Me?
And now it's my privilege to celebrate two very, very special, whoops, we're gonna put my video back on. And now we're going to have a chance to celebrate two very, very special wedding anniversaries. The first anniversary we're going to celebrate is for Elsie and Jack Blanco, who are celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary tonight, and to Paul and Jill Weiner, who are celebrating their 30th anniversary. We want you for a moment as you celebrate together tonight to just close your eyes and think back to that moment you stood beneath the chuppah with each other when you embarked on your road of life together 50 and 30 years ago. To think about all that you have shared since you left that sacred transformative space, arm in arm, hand in hand, as you embarked on the road of life together. How you have together raised children and welcomed grandchildren, some of you. Jill and Paul will give you a break on that. They'll get there eventually, I promise. But mostly we think about how together you have fashioned lives that have been filled with love and with promise, how you have explored the world together and how you have explored the inner worlds of each other together. We pray that you will continue to enjoy lives filled with health and love and joy and peace. And if you are willing, you may kiss the bride.
Simin tov, mazel tov, mazel tov, simin tov, simin tov, mazel tov, mazel tov, simin tov, simin tov, mazel tov, mazel tov, simin tov, Yelanu.
Thank you.
Mazel tov to everybody.
Thank you.
We are absolutely blessed tonight to have one of the most popular speakers in all of South Florida and an incredible scholar who will be sharing with us some thoughts and some reflections on this unique moment in history in which we find ourselves, Dr. Robert Watson. Dr. Watson is an award-winning author who has published 40 books and hundreds of scholarly articles, chapters, and essays on topics of history and politics. He has written books called Affairs of State, The President's Wives, America's First Crisis, which was named the Book of the Year in History at the Independent Publishers Awards, The Nazi Titanic, and The Ghost Ship of Brooklyn. He has been a frequent commentator on many different news programs from here and literally all over the world. He has convened and co-convened a half dozen national conferences on the American presidency, co-founded the annual Truman Legacy Symposium held at the Harry S. Truman Little White House, sponsored by the Truman Presidential Library, and has served as a visiting fellow or scholar with dozens of noted organizations and presidential libraries. He is the editor of the popular multi-edition encyclopedia sets The American Presidents and American First Ladies. And as a community leader and volunteer, he has long been active in an array of different initiatives, hosting countless voter registration drives, mock elections, civic education programs for schools, workshops, and for social studies teachers, all kinds of different projects, including spelling bees and moderator for political debates. He has been named the Outstanding Professor of the Year at Florida Atlantic University and at Lynn University 3 times, and has won numerous awards. We are so blessed that he is here as Professor of American Studies and Director of Project Civitas at Lynn University and Senior Fellow at the Florida Joint Center for Citizenship. Dr. Watson, we're so glad to have you with us tonight.
Well, thank you. Shabbat Shalom, everyone. And thank you, Rabbi Dan and Rabbi Jessica, Rabbi Weissman. I appreciate it. And let me just say congratulations to Seth on the bar mitzvah. And we do have some impressive anniversaries there as well. Cantor Lori, I always enjoy the music. And to the 2 singers, that was absolutely beautiful. I'm inspired. So with that, I would ask that the tech staff go ahead and pull up the PowerPoint that I put together for everybody. And what I thought we'd do is we'd start talking a little bit about, here we go. And you can go ahead and forward to the next slide. So I have the pleasure of coming back and being with you at the end of this program to talk a little bit about some takeaways from 2020 and looking at some of the prospects for 2021. I also want to talk a little bit about our national agenda for healing and bipartisanship. And I think the biggest challenge facing us as a country, and that would be the incivility that seems to plague politics in all ways. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But what I have a few minutes to share with you now. So what I thought I would do is talk a little bit about Biden's record with Israel and Harris's record with Israel. I have the pleasure of knowing a lot of you, and you have the mispleasure of knowing me, displeasure. I've come before you in the past. So all of you know that I have said for my entire 30-year career, I've written this, I've researched it, I stand behind it, that I believe almost every president has been good for Israel. And I believe every Congress in modern times has been good for Israel. We can define good for Israel in a number of ways, which I will here in just a moment. Of course, I've always felt that Harry Truman constituted the high watermark, but really established a way that the US and American presidents can serve Israel. And because this was a bitter campaign and our nation is more divided now than I believe any time since the 60s, and that would be the 1860s and the Civil War, I simply wanted to say, not from a partisan perspective, but that I believe that Israel will have a friend in Biden and a friend in Harris. So just very quickly, I made a couple of points here for all of you. So first off, Biden's starting to make his appointments already. And what you're seeing is he's made several appointments of prominent Jewish politicians in his administration. In fact, the most senior folks in his administration are all Jewish. Tony Blinken as Secretary of State, Janet Yellen as Secretary of the Treasury, Alejandro Mayorkas as the Department of Homeland Security Secretary, and Biden's long-term aide, Ron Klain, will be his chief of staff. He also has a number of key advisors, speechwriters, and policy people that are Jewish, and has throughout his long career in the Senate and his years as vice president. For what that's worth, I think it does bring a perspective to the table in important decisions. And Israel is facing a number of great challenges right now. I'm sad to say I believe Israel finds itself perhaps more isolated in the international community now than in a long time. and that will be important. Also, we've seen over the past couple of years, studies by the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, Southern Poverty Law Center, the Brandeis Brennan Centers, Trinity College, the FBI, have all pointed toward an alarming spike in anti-Semitic violence, microaggressions toward Jewish students on campuses, defamation or painting of swastikas in Jewish cemeteries. So this is really alarming. So I think it's vitally important that Israel and the larger Jewish diaspora will have a seat at the highest level in the Biden administration, and that perspective will be part of the decision making. Biden's voting record in the Senate, because he spent years in the Senate, he has a clear voting record. It's way over 90% supportive of Israel. The only votes year in and year out over his long career that were not, I guess you could say, supportive of Israel, he was opposed to the annexation and some settlements and disagreed with Mr. Netanyahu on occasion. I have what I refer to as the Big Ten, and that is when folks say, what does it mean to be good for Israel? What I've always said is we go back to 1948, and I guess the big three, that would be Dr. Chaim Weizmann, David Ben-Gurion, and Ambassador Abba Eban, met with Truman, and they said, there's some things we need. Truman basically said, what can I do for you? After recognizing Israel as a state on May 14th, 1948, at 6:11 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, by the way, he said, what can I do for you? And they laid out roughly 10 things. So what I often do is I look at Congresses and presidents from 48 until now, who has come through with these 10? And these are things like providing loan guarantees, national security advice and exchanges, joint military cooperation, joint intelligence sharing, immigration exchanges, cultural exchanges, intelligence, and so forth, protecting Israeli copyrights and patents in world courts, offering Israel most favored nation trading status. This is important today because much of the world is boycotting. Israel will not sell to or buy from. And of course, key vetoes in the UN when typically every year multiple anti-Israel measures come up. And most presidents have come through with the lion's share of those. Biden's voting record in the Senate shows that on all 10 issues, he's been there for year after year after year. Biden has made many visits to Israel. He was first elected in 1972, and one of the very first visits he made in 73 after being sworn in was to Israel. He's been back a number of times. Biden has spoken to major Jewish organizations in the U.S., including AIPAC, J Street, the ADL, and so on. Go ahead and forward to the next slide. We'll continue. Biden's son, his beloved son, Bo, who passed away. Bo's wife is Jewish, Ashley, and his grandchildren are, which I think helps to reiterate this perspective that will be a part foremost in his thoughts when making important decisions. Biden disagreed. He opposed with Bush 1 and Reagan during their massive arms sales to Saudi Arabia and a lot of Israel's Arab neighbors. Remember, they sold F-15s, AWACS planes, and a lot of Israelis and a lot of folks were very concerned about that. He opposed that. Biden was the co-sponsor of the Palestinian Anti-Terrorism Act, which pretty much linked and tied U.S. aid to the Palestinians to them not hitting Israel or sponsoring terrorism. He also has been a major supporter of the Taylor Force Act, which says that if the Palestinians are involved in any terrorist activities, the U.S. will sanction them and cut off aid. Biden has worked the phones repeatedly on that. Go ahead and forward to our next one here. As we all know, the U.S. provides its largest loan guarantees and security packages to Israel, and we have for years. Biden has, of course, voted for those and was a champion for those under Obama. But Biden was known for working the phones to secure additional security assistance. This is one of the times he was very, very active in leading this effort. So whatever assistance was out there, he secured additional assistance. Let me hit the third one on the screen here while I'm on that point. Biden was also well known for working the phones to build support for the U.S. contributions to the Iron Dome, David Sling, and the Arrow. You're all probably familiar with those. Those are three of Israel's, those are their main anti-missile systems. The Iron Dome is for short-range missiles, 2 to about 48 miles, with remarkable success rates in knocking missiles out of the sky. David Sling is their one for intermediate range, and the Arrow is for, ICBMs, intercontinental, for the long range. So Biden secured additional aid for that. In 2010, he took yet another trip to Israel, and I think this is telling. While Biden was in Israel, Bibi Netanyahu announced additional settlements and annexations, which the timing of it, and I'm not being partisan, but it was clearly embarrassing and disrespectful to Biden while he was there. Biden publicly stated his disagreement with that, but we have a number of accounts of him meeting with leaders of the Knesset and Bibi Netanyahu saying, "I am your great friend. I am with you no matter what. Even the embarrassment of this visit, I'm with you." And I think that says a lot to him, not holding a grudge, recognizing that U.S.-Israeli relations transcend party and transcend any one individual who happens to be in charge. And I think that's important. Next one. Let's see what else I have. Okay. It's hard to name anybody in Congress or Washington that has been more aggressive in fighting against the resurgence of anti-Semitic violence, hate crimes, extremism in the country than Joe Biden. He's really been all over this and vocal about it for years. You're all probably familiar with the BDS movement. That's the boycott, divest, sanction movement. This is sadly alive and influential on many college campuses. The goal is to get U.S. colleges to divest from Israel, but also to stop exchanges with students and faculty and museum exhibits and orchestras, and which is just horrific. I have had I wear it as a badge of honor of being booed and boycotted when I'm on college campuses around the country by the BDS movement. The one that I think is far more alarming than BDS, which Biden has also weighed in on repeatedly, is the SJP. That's the Students for Justice in Palestine. And what they have done is they have these Israel genocide, Israel, these really violent militaristic, displays on campuses where they throw red paint around to symbolize blood. They claim Israel is an apartheid state and so on and so forth. So Biden's been all over that. The Trump administration had stopped a program and funding to address the anti-extremists, these KKK neo-Nazi groups. Biden has already promised that will be fully funded when he's president. He wants to restart the Palestinian peace process, and the Trump administration had dropped diplomatic ties with the Palestinians. Biden wants to renew those and also renew our humanitarian aid to Israel. I've read a couple folks that said, they're concerned, will he provide aid if the Palestinians use that for terror activities or anti-Israel measures? Remember, he co-sponsored the major bill that precludes or forbids that. On the embassy, Biden was opposed to moving it from Tel Aviv to the current location, although he has said on multiple occasions he would not try to move it back. He felt it was the wrong time and it might have undermined support for Israel, but he said he wouldn't move it back. Okay, let's move forward and see what else I put on here. Kamala Harris. Her voting record, she's been in Congress a lot shorter, of course, than Biden, but her voting record is the same. It's way over 90%. It's nearly 100%, quite frankly. I should say that her husband, you're all probably aware, is Doug Emhoff. He's Jewish. It's kind of cute. I'm a big Doug Emhoff fan, by the way, and it was cute. There was an organization talking about hot Jewish dads. Okay, so I'm sure Rabbi Levin is on that list, but Emhoff was like Mr. December or something. But he had the good grace to laugh about it and say, for crying out loud. But Doug Emhoff is an impressive fellow. She has made multiple visits to Israel, countless times. She also has made prominent appearances before and spoken to AIPAC, J Street, ADL, and so on. Her very first resolution as a U.S. Senator that she introduced was to support Israel, her very first bill. And I've always been one for saying that I think you can read into the symbolism of a president's very first executive order, a member of Congress's very first bill, I used to do through the University of Miami, I did a good government initiative. We worked with folks that wanted to run for mayor, city council, state senator, whatever, local and state politicians. And we put on little programs, how to be a politician. I brought in lawyers to talk to them, former elected officials. And we also did the same thing for newly elected folks before they were sworn in. And I always would ask them about what's their first measure going to be. I want you to think long and hard about that, because that speaks volumes about your priorities. So I've always felt that was important. So Harris's very first one was supporting Israel. Go ahead and go to the next slide. She has been a co-sponsor of measures against this resurgence of anti-Semitic violence and hate. She has co-sponsored measures to study and make recommendations on the resurgence of vandalism, microaggressions towards Jews. And also, she sponsored the resolution right after that horrific Tree of Life attack at the Pittsburgh synagogue in 2018. She was the one who sponsored that. In 2019, the horrific attack at a Chabad house, she was the sponsor of that as well. She's also co-sponsored measures for the U.S. to support Israel in the United Nations. Now, these are largely symbolic, but I do believe important nonetheless. Congress cannot force a president or the president's UN ambassador to veto something on behalf of Israel or offer support for Israel. But the fact that Congress is introducing a resolution, and especially when it passes, as Harris's did, I think that sends an important message to not only Israel and the UN, but to the global community. Let's see if I have anything else up there. Oops, I don't. So let me just say a word about civility, and then I'll turn this over to our far more capable rabbis and other leaders in the congregation. So just a quick word. If you want to look at civility, I'm an historian. You go back to the founding of the country. The framers gathered in the hot, humid summer of 1787 in Philadelphia, and my goodness, were the stakes high. Remember, they were creating a brand new form of government, never seen before on this earth. And if it didn't work, they could be at the end of a noose. Of course, emotions were high, the stakes were high, animosities were high. They were all type A personalities. You put them all in one room. And remember, back then, this is before air conditioning. So it was hot and humid. What the framers did in Philadelphia, I think we should draw a lesson from today. They wanted to make sure that that important summer in Philadelphia would be led by civility. So they spent a lot of time trying to figure out what are the foundations of this theory called democracy that they were going to be the first to put in place. They read Plato and Aristotle, Locke and Hobbes, Montesquieu, Rousseau, all the classics. And they studied it and they came up with the following. The foundations of government of, by, and for the people, the philosophical basis, the foundations were the following. I call them the 3 C's. They didn't use these words, but they used these concepts. As a professor, I always try to put something in a way that people will remember. The 3 C's: compromise, cooperation, and consensus. Got that, everyone? Cooperation, compromise, and consensus. According to the framers, those were the keys, the philosophical, the foundational keys for democracy to work. Then what they did is they not only pledged themselves to adhere to those 3 C's during the summer, but they tried to make sure that they imbued the Constitution with those 3 C's. So how do you put cooperation, compromise, and consensus into the Constitution? Here's how. And this, I believe, is the genius of the framers. And it's going to sound counterintuitive. They assured cooperation, compromise, and consensus by instituting conflict. That sounds counterintuitive, right, everybody? Conflict. Think about it. The House against the Senate, the Congress against the president, the courts against everyone, feds against the states. The president can appoint, Congress can not confirm, the president can push a treaty, the Congress cannot ratify, the president can veto, Congress can override. Our entire system of government is based on conflict. I teach that the Constitution is an invitation to struggle. Now, that may sound counterintuitive, but here's the genius of the framers. In a system based on conflict, where there are hurdles and road bumps before everything we do, the only way to move forward is through what? Cooperation, compromise, and consensus. So I think we should take a lesson from the framers and renew the spirit of compromise and cooperation. I am always, appalled when a politician will swear that I will never compromise, or they thump their chest. And no. The essence, according to our framers, of our system is cooperation, compromise, and consensus. So thank you, and I look forward to seeing you at the end of this service. Shabbat Shalom.
Dr. Watson, Shabbat Shalom to you. Thank you so much for sharing your insights about our incoming president and vice president, and for those words at the end, a bit of a testament to the beauty of our nation and our constitutional system. I look forward to learning more from you at the end of the service tonight as well.
Thank you,
But this
Rabbi.
time we'll take a moment now and think of those in our families and our community who are in need of healing, those who are suffering from illness and from injury. And we pray for their healing of mind, of body, and spirit, and we say, Mishaberach Avotenu Vimotenu, may the God who blessed our ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, bring them the gift of Refuah Shlema. In addition to those who you hold in your hearts and your minds this time, we as a community and a congregation think of Samuel Agranal, Perry Bear, Fred Belkin, Barbara Bernardi, Margie Berman Block, Kathleen Bowersox, Lawrence Bowman, Roy Cohen, Lynn Edinger, Arnold Erne, Estelle Erne, Eileen Feinerman, Peter Feldman, Marty Fromowitz, Bob Geller, Larry Guys, Nate Goldberg, Jake Goldstein, Mike Graff, Ed Hames, Hannah Hoffman, Keith Homer, Michelle Cahan, Marcos Kaplan, Norman Kaufman, Florence Koish, Diana Koch, Judy Kornitsky, Amalia Kotler, Mickey Cutler, Lori Mariano, Jesso Martins, Susan Myers, Shirley Ann Myers, Victoria Nelson, Lisa Nyron, Alan Aknowski, Maurice Plow, Ronald Rao, Gustavo Ribeiro, Ellen Romberg, Cynthia Romero, Melissa Rose, Eileen Rosenbaum, Alan Rosenfeld, Sharon Rubin, Ruth Moriah Bat Shoshana Miriam, Bonnie Schaefer, Linda Weingart Schulman, Lori Schaefer, Eileen Shore, Len Sirowitz, Mickey Sirowitz, Michael Sprinzen, Gary Stromberg, Mitchell Wachtel, Karen Warner, Ava Marie Wildforster, Jeff Wissett, Israel Yamuter, Linda Yankow, and Joel Ziegler, and we pray for their healing. As we say, Baruch atah Adonai Rofei HaCholim, we praise you, Adonai, our God, who helps bring healing to the sick.
Bless those in need of healing with refuah shlema, the renewal of body, the renewal of spirit, and let us say Amen.
And if you are able to, please rise for the Aleinu. Aleinu l'shabeach l'adon hakol, לתת גדולה ליוצא בראשית, שלא עשנו כגויי הארצות, ולא שמנו כמשפחות האדמה, שלא שם חלקנו כהם, וגוהר עלינו כהמונם. ואנחנו קוראים ומשתחווים ומודים לפני מלך מלכי המלכים הקדוש ברוך הוא, ונאמר והיה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ, ביום ההוא יהיה אדוני אחד, ושמו אחד.
Our thoughts now turn to those who have come and gone, those whose lives brought us joy and celebration, and whose memories live on through us as a blessing. At the yahrzeit, the anniversary of their passing, we recall Pearl Alt, Malka Altman, Stephen Asner, Doris Baraban, Francis N. Barr, Margie Bass, Samuel Berkman, Faye Bell, Stuart Block, Lenore Brockman, Paul Brazier, Jeanette Lyons Bush, Dr. Melvin Clayman, Melvin B. Clayton, Shirley Cohen, Brian R. Cohen, Joseph Cohen, Dr. Morton J. Crow, Joseph Ender, Sandra Evans, Robert Feinstein, Edgar Feastall, Elio Ruth Fine, Dr. Alexander Sand Fisher, Sadie Friedman, Gertrude Kerman Furman, Sidney Genn, Burton Gimelstob, Priscilla Glovsky, Ben Goldberg, Sam Goldman, Harry Goldstein, Walter Green, Leo Greenfield, William Greenspan, Harriet Hampton, Bruce Hausman, Mildred Hyman, Lynn Jackman, Melvin Kendall, Carolyn B. Kaufman, Joanne Liebman, David Loeb, Edith Mackless, Solomon Matulam, Nathan Marco, Rose Sterneck Miller, Samuel I. Morris, Rose Abrams Knockless, Teresa Naiman, Leonard Neymark, Benjamin Narenberg, Stephen M. Newman, Sarah Oppenheimer, Teresa Paralek, Bertha Pasternak, Sidney Pateska, Sam Rakis, Ryan Scott Reno, Abraham Robinson, Sylvia Rothberg, Jacob Rubenstein, Margaret Serafin, Tilla Sherman, Murray Schusterman, Sidney Stein, Rose Sunshine, Jack Tamarkin, Esther Gurovitz Toback, Joan Tucker, Oscar Warner, Charles Wertman, Joan Joy Wiesenfeld, and Irving Woolen. And those who've passed in the last 30 days, those in the period of Shloshim, we remember Lynn Metzger, Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs, Harvey Ehrenstein, Regina Dreyer Thomas, Steve Morlini, Uri Pimstein, Janet L. Barmack Snyder, Stuart Hershey, Allison Joe Golden, Risha Levy, Howard Leishman, Bradley Stone, and Samuel Gitlin. Of all of them, we say Zichronam Livracha, and for them and for everyone else we carry in our hearts, together now we say the words of Mourner's Kaddish. Yit Gadal, the Yit Kadash, Shemei Rabbah. Be'alma, Divra, Chirutei, V'yamlich Malchutei. B'chayechon, Uv'yomechon, Uv'chaye Dechol Beit Yisrael. Ba'agala Uv'izman Kariv, V'imru Amen. Yehei Shmei Rabbah Mevarach, Le'alam Ulalmei Almaya. Yitbarach V'yishtabach, V'yitpa'ar, V'yitromam V'yitnaseh. V'yit Hadar, V'yit Ale, V'yit Halal, Shemei Dekudsha Brichu. Le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata, tushbachata v'nechamata, da'amiran be'alma ve'imru, amen. Yehi shlama rabba min shemaya, v'chaim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael, ve'imru, amen. Osei shalom bimromav, hu ya'asei shalom, aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael, ve'imru, amen. May the one who sends peace from the high heavens send peace to all of us, and comfort those who are bereaved, as together we say, Amen.
Ose shalom bimromav, hu ya'aseh shalom aleinu. Ose shalom bimromav, hu ya'aseh shalom aleinu. Say shalom bimromav, hu yaseh shalom aleinu. Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu. Ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu. Ve'al kol Yisrael.
Shabbat Shalom, everybody. Some brief announcements. First, we really want to give a mazel tov to Seth Kaplan and his parents on his bar mitzvah weekend tomorrow. We look forward to celebrating with him. Special mazel tov again to Spencer and to Francie on their milestone birthdays, and to Elsie and Jack and Jill and Paul on their wonderful anniversaries. Please stay with us following services for more of Dr. Robert Watson. Stay on and he will continue his conversation with us. We're grateful to have him with us. And next week, don't forget our incredible Shabbat in Hanukkah service. We will have a retelling of the Hanukkah story like you have never seen. This service is going to be filled with music and with great program. It's going to be a wonderful Shabbat. That's next Friday at 7:30. And all through the celebration of Hanukkah, all 8 nights of Hanukkah, there are different ways that you can connect with Temple Bethel. You can check the website, tbeboca.org, for all of the different programs that we have about Hanukkah. We encourage you to join us tomorrow morning, 9:30, for Torah study. And on Tuesday, our Lunch and Learn series continues with Haftarah, Hanukkah, and History. Rabbi Mates is teaching. Wednesday evening, we have Rabbi Amy Pessa, who will be leading us in Jewish meditation. And many more programs can be found on the Temple's website. Lastly, we hope that you will continue to support our congregation's project, The Giving Tree. You can sign up to purchase gifts for a needy person in our area for the holidays. And you can go to thegivingtreeboca.org for more information. Please, please, please give to those who need. And anybody in this dark and difficult time who needs support from the congregation, we don't want anyone to feel at risk. We don't want anyone to feel unsafe. If you have a problem, please never hesitate to call us, 561-391-8900. And now Rabbi Weissman will lead us in the Motzi, because believe me, they have the best challahs of any of us.
Here they are. Motzi lechem min haaretz, we give thanks to God for bread. Our voices rise in song together as our joyful prayer is said. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, hamotzi lechem min haaretz. Amen. Shabbat shalom, everyone.
Shabbat shalom. We'll go back to Dr. Watson in a second, but I just wanted to share that in my Facebook feed a few weeks ago was the 5th anniversary of one of his lectures at Temple. He has lectured at Temple many times about Truman and about the Nazi Titanic, this amazing story he uncovered. And any room he is in at Temple, whether it's the sanctuary or the social hall, this picture was from the social hall, there are 300 people packed in the room. I think we ran out of chairs on the day. He's just an amazing speaker, and we're so happy to have him back. We're going to go back into about a half hour or so, digging a little deeper on some of these points, looking back, looking forward a month after the election. So Dr. Watson, I'll hand things back over to you.
Okay, Rabbi Jessica, thank you. You are mistaken on one thing, and they were there for the music and the spirituality. I happened to be just in the neighborhood, so I stopped in. That's why everybody was there. So let's go ahead and bring the PowerPoint up again, and we'll continue our conversation. What I tried to do here was a couple of things. One is historically, it's been very important that we have a peaceful and civil transfer of power. Also, I've been getting a lot of questions about, will the Democrats try to pack or unpack the Supreme Court? And I found that there's an awful lot of misinformation out there from all sources on how this would happen, whether it's constitutional, legal, with precedent. So I thought we'd run through that a little bit and then talk about a couple of other things as we can have an agenda of healing. So first off, peaceful transfer of power. There's a difference between a peaceful transfer of power and a civil transfer of power. A peaceful transfer of power is the tanks don't run out on the street, don't come out on the streets. The president doesn't refuse to leave. The military or the police are not called out, kind of a thing. A civil transfer of power is the outgoing administration cooperates with the incoming administration and assists in a seamless transition of power. So there's a difference between peaceful and civil. Both of them are hallmarks for democracy. And quite frankly, over our history, we've always had peaceful. And in fact, I think it's one of the things that has set us apart from the rest of the world. And we've had some rough and tight elections in our history. The 1800 election, for example, ended up in a dead heat, an exact tie in the Electoral College, 73 to 73. It was a three-way race with Jefferson, Burr, Aaron Burr, and Adams, John Adams. Jefferson and Burr tied. This was the first election with political parties, and it was very tense, and it got quite negative. To get this, they had to have 36 tiebreaker votes over a 4-month period. That election dragged out November, December, January, February. So some folks were concerned that this election dragged out 4 days and could have dragged out a week or 2 or 3. That was 4 entire months, but yet in the end, it was a peaceful transfer of power. In 1824, there was a difficult election. It was John Quincy Adams against Andrew Jackson. And this election, we really saw the, I guess you could say, bifurcation split in the country, north, south, eastern seaboard, western, educated, uneducated, urban or cities versus the rural areas, a real split with the north, the eastern folks, educated folks voting for John Quincy Adams, and rural, southern, western interest voting for Jackson. Now, Jackson was ahead of John Quincy Adams in both the popular vote and the Electoral College, but unless if you get a majority of the Electoral College, which is today 270 out of 538 electors, that's 435 for the House, plus 100 for the Senate equals 535, plus 3 for DC equals 538. So unless if you get a majority, there has to be a tiebreaker mechanism. They went to the tiebreaker, and the House gave it to John Quincy Adams, even though he was trailing Jackson in both the popular and electoral. So that was difficult, yet it was a peaceful transfer of power. In 1876, it was Rutherford B. Hayes, a Republican from Ohio, against Samuel Tilden, a Democrat from New York. Tilden was ahead of Hayes in both the popular and electoral college, but didn't have a majority. And there were 3 southern states that had yet to cast their vote. They couldn't decide how they wanted to certify their electors. That was South Carolina, Louisiana, and of course, Florida. It's always us. And what Congress did was, instead of voting, they put together a 15-member bipartisan commission, 8 Republicans, 7 Democrats, to decide how to certify those 3 states. By a 1 margin vote on straight party lines, 8-7, they certified all 3 for the Republican Hayes, who won the Electoral College 185-184 by a single vote. So we've had some rough ones, yet we've always had a peaceful transfer of power. The 2 transfers of power that weren't civil in terms of cooperation you see on the screen here. On the right, that's John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson had beat Adams, as you just heard me say, in 1800, and in 1801, Adams did not cooperate. Adams was mad at his good friend Jefferson, who challenged him not once, but twice. He had challenged him 4 years earlier and then beat him and got ugly and negative. So the night before the inauguration, which back then was March 4th, today it's January 20th, they moved it up in 1937 as per the 20th Amendment. So the night before the inauguration, John Adams was so mad, he loaded up his carriage under the cover of darkness and snuck out of the city. Jefferson arrived for the inaugural and they couldn't find the president. Now, it wasn't such a big deal. I mean, Adams was wrong, but it wasn't such a big deal that there wasn't a civil cooperation because Jefferson had been vice president. And of course, in 1801, we didn't have an existential threat of climate change, nuclear war, international terrorism, or a global pandemic. The other one was, as you see the photo here on the left, was Truman and Eisenhower. I like Ike, and of course you all know Harry is my hero, as you heard Rabbi Jessica note. Truman was prepared to be the first president in history to really offer a full-on briefing for not only the incoming president, but his entire staff. This would be what we do today or in modern times. However, Eisenhower stiffed Truman and wouldn't get out of his car to come in and meet with him and wouldn't meet with him for the briefing. So that was ridiculous. Ike then did not do that for Kennedy, which is a shame. Kennedy was planning on doing it, but was assassinated. So Lyndon Johnson offered it for Nixon. I'm happy to say that in recent presidencies, we've seen a remarkably helpful civil transfer of power. Bush 1 was nothing shy of gracious and helpful with Bill Clinton and his whole team coming in, as Clinton was with W, as W was with Obama, as Obama was with Trump. So I'm guardedly optimistic. I'm hopeful that President Trump and his team will come around and do this. It's vitally important that they do it, everybody, for operational, logistical, even IT. Think about the number of countless thousands of computers and computer systems in the government. Imagine the State Department with embassies all over the world and diplomatic envoys all over the world, and the Department of Defense with military bases, even the login codes, and the security issues and the protocols for terrorism and war. I mean, all this has to be done. So let's hope that the President Trump recognizes this and does the right thing. Sadly, so far, the president and his staff are not cooperating whatsoever, but the career bureaucrats are cooperating and are meeting with Biden. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. And I think I continue this conversation. There we go. So the other concern is a truncated presidential transition. The longer President Trump waits, the less time Biden has. Now, the incoming president will have to appoint between 4,000 and 5,000 people. Wow. Almost 1,000 of them require Senate confirmation. And today they need to be screened, briefed, and we need to have a clearance. So it's a very intricate process. You cannot afford a year, a month, heck, a day. You need to be ready to govern on day one, especially with the crises that we have today. Now, by law, there is transition funding. So the incoming administration gets a budget. Today, it's $7 million. That was pushed by Obama in 2010. So Obama made sure Trump had this. This pays for computers, office space, and the process of screening and appointing so many thousands of people. So this is important. What we're seeing right now, even if there's not cooperation politically, these career bureaucrats, as I wrote at the bottom of the screen, they put together agency transition liaisons. So the FBI, the CIA, the Justice Department, the EPA, everybody has a liaison to prepare the incoming administration. Good. Okay, let's go ahead and continue to the next one. Okay, and you can forward that again. So Biden's cabinets and appointments. So you heard me say he has to make 15 cabinet appointments because there's 15 departments. Each one is a secretary, but there's also one or more deputy, assistant, and undersecretaries. There's all the alphabet soup, the FBI, CIA, EPA, OSHA, FDA, FCC, FTC, and it goes on for forever. Those need to be appointed. All of our embassies, our NATO staff, our Organization of American States staff, our UN staff, and the list goes on. One thing that Biden has announced quite clearly, and his early appointments seem to say that he's backing it up. This is what he's prioritizing: diversity. So we've seen a lot of diversity. Previous White Houses, Obama had a lot of diversity. Bill Clinton and George W. Bush had diversity in their administration. So he's really prioritizing that. We're on par to perhaps have a record number of women selected. As you heard me say a moment ago, most of the senior people thus far are Jewish. He's also picking a lot of people from the Obama administration. And Biden, relatively unique in modern times, he seems to be valuing experience over big, splashy and flashy names. There's some big names out there everybody thought would be the first people he picked. Instead, he picked people that are quieter and behind the scenes, but that have an incredible array of experience. He has said that he's going to offer Republicans positions in his cabinet, which I think is vitally important. He's already been talking with Meg Whitman, the CEO, and a couple of others. Some progressives are upset because Biden has been picking a lot of centrists. He said he was going to balance the centrist wing with the progressive wing. Good luck with that. So far, he's picking mostly centrist, and he's already laid out his healthcare advisory team, which is a who's who in the medical world. It must be said that a lot of Trump's appointments were not the quality cabinet of a George Washington or a Ronald Reagan or an FDR, let's just say. So we see that some of the senior people, I listed them here on the screen, and let's go ahead and move forward to the next slide. There's some more folks that have been listed, and Linda Thomas Greenfield is first African-American woman in that position. I put some big names at the bottom of the screen. It's expected that a lot of these folks will get jobs. A lot could be czars or envoys. There's already some talk of Andrew Yang as sort of a tech an entrepreneurship envoy, maybe Julian Castro as a liaison with the Latino community, or our southern border, which is tense. Beto O'Rourke is maybe a gun czar, or dealing with this violence of gun crimes, and so on and so forth. Doug Jones is a Democratic senator in Alabama who lost his reelection to the former Auburn football coach. It's Alabama, after all. Doug Jones had prosecuted the KKK, neo-Nazis, and he did some pretty risky and impressive cases. So he could be in position for something in the Justice Department, or at the least a liaison on this resurgence of hate that we've seen. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So one of the things that I'm excited about, and you've been hearing a lot of buzz, if ever we needed election reform, it's now. If ever the country was finally supportive of election reforms, it's now. I think we literally need dozens and dozens and dozens of election reforms, from little things to big things. At the high end level, I'd get rid of the Electoral College. I'm not holding my breath. But at the lower end level, we need more focus on better designed ballots, better voting technology, better voter education. We had a record turnout this time, and I think that all of us should applaud these elections officials around the country, Democrat, Republican, and nonpartisan, who, despite a record turnout, despite repeated allegations that it's a fraud or hoax, despite a record number of votes by mail, which take longer to count, you have to match the signature, they managed, in the middle of a pandemic, so they didn't have the volunteers and the staff that they usually have to help with the counting, they managed to count the largest and one of the more controversial elections in a short 4 days. Historically, it took weeks for a lot of these elections. But I do think we need to look again at early voting, absentee voting, or vote by mail, maybe even same-day voter registration. A lot of states like Florida have closed primaries. That is, if you're a Republican, you can only vote Republican in the primary. You can't vote across the ballot. There's talk of open primaries, or what's sometimes called a blanket primary. You can vote for multiple different parties. So I do think that we will see some push for and some election reforms. You know, there was attempts to hack us and influence the election by Russia. Everybody has said this, including the Republican Senate, the Democratic House, and all of our intelligence agencies. There's some concern that China and Iran also tried this time around. We'll probably find out more about that in the weeks and months to come. But either way, we have to harden our election architecture. We really haven't done that since 2016, which is shocking, but we need to do that. I also think we need to look at the role of the social media. You know, I've always called it the misinformation superhighway. You know, there are groups like the Russians and perhaps the Chinese and Iranians who have used our own social media as a platform for propaganda, disinformation, and misinformation. I'm a First Amendment freedom of speech person, so I'm not saying censor. But what I'm saying is, if there's bold-faced lies that are threatening our electoral system, which, make no mistake about it, you know, this is the foundation of our democracy. An attack on our elections is like shooting down an airplane. So we do need to figure out if we're going to have fact-checking or some kind of screening process. I'm not sure what the answer is, but we need a national dialogue on it. And I think at the bottom of the screen, I think we'd all agree we need civic education. I'm always appalled when I hear people of both parties talk about elections and how little people know. I'm a professor, been one for 30 years at a number of universities across the country, from Hawaii to Yale to many points in between. And I also lecture at universities around the country on a regular basis throughout the year, at least BC, before COVID. And what I can say is, boy, our civic education has taken a hit. We need to reinvigorate civic education. And I would add to that, what we're trying to do at little old Lynn University is I created years ago, as you heard Rabbi Levin say, a civility initiative. We are integrating civility into our curriculum as if it was math or science. It's part of what the students do. In order to graduate from Lynn, You don't just take a class on Shakespeare or calculus. You have to do community service and learn about civility and learn about citizenship. You have to help others. We do everything from bringing World War II vets and Holocaust survivors on campus to talk to folks, to going out to VAs, to making sandwiches for soup kitchens, to cleaning the beach. We adopt foster care facilities around South Florida, and we have almost 100% buy-in, participation, students, faculty, staff. We load up little like backpacks full of toothbrushes and toys and combs and all sorts of things, goods and stuff and the necessities, and we actually give them, physically hand them to foster kids all around the area. So I think we need to focus on civility and a civic education. Next slide. Okay, so there's been a lot of talk about packing, unpacking, and there's been talk by legal scholars of maybe making some reforms to the Supreme Court. Let me talk about that briefly. Packing is when you add justices to the Supreme Court or any court. Unpacking is when you remove justices from the court. Is this constitutional? Yes. Is it legal? Yes. Is it precedented? Several times. Yeah. I'm not saying I favor it. In fact, I don't. But there's been a lot of misinformation about it. At any rate, Article 3 of the Constitution is about the judiciary. 1's about the Congress, Article 2 about the presidents, 4 about amendments, and so forth and so on, of the 7. So Article 3 is about the judiciary. It does not say how many justices should be on the Supreme Court, nor does it say anything one way or the other about packing or unpacking. Why? By the end of that summer in Philadelphia in 1787, the framers were sick of one another. They were worried that the arguments were such that they wouldn't sign off on the Constitution. So rather than deal with all the touchy and difficult aspects of the court, they just said, well, we'll leave it vague, we'll call it a day and make sure we sign the thing. What they knew was a couple of things would happen. Number one, everybody knew George Washington would be the first president, and through his every action and inaction, everything he said and did and didn't say and didn't do, it would create precedents that would be better than what they would come up with. They also knew that the great John Jay would likely be the first Chief Justice of this new court. And John Jay was also a great man who his actions also carved out the precedents for the court. The third thing they agreed on is they should set it up by legislation. So in 1789, they passed the Judiciary Act. And this is what governs packing and unpacking. The Judiciary Act created 6 Supreme Court justices, so just 6. In our history, we've increased it and decreased it. For example, didn't take long. In 1801, John Adams unpacked it from 6 to 5. In 1802, Thomas Jefferson packed it back to 6. And then in 1807, he packed it to 7. In 1837, Andrew Jackson added 2. Then in 1863, even Abraham Lincoln added 1 to bring it to 10. In 1866, after the Civil War, our 17th president, Andrew Johnson, backed it down to 7. He unpacked it. And then in 1869, President Ulysses Grant moved it to 9. Why 9? There were 9 federal appellate courts. Today, there are 13. So some people have said we should move the Supreme Court to 13. At any rate, so that's what all you need to do to pack or unpack is pass legislation. So you don't need to amend the Constitution. They've unpacked the court in 2 ways, either through attrition, if someone dies, they just don't replace it, or LIFO, last in, first out. So that's the options before the Dems. The other thing that there's a group of Ivy League legal scholars, Ivy League professors, and former federal judges. They are worried that now the Supreme Court has become politicized, which is terrible. And they're worried about the independence, political independence of the court and where they should go from here. So they've made a number of proposals, and I wanted to share them with you. There's been some talk in the blogosphere, and I've talked to some reporters that said that this could pick up momentum. I don't know. I'm not holding my breath. But here's what they're saying. Right now, we have what's called the Good Behavior Clause. It's based on English common law. They even spell behavior with the U, the British way. So the Good Behavior Clause from centuries ago said that if a judge is, behaving, is doing the job, they should have a life term. They should serve for life. This would also create a degree of independence for the court and allow them to be a form of check and balance against the monarch or the parliament or whomever. So the framers liked that idea. So we use the good behavior clause in our Constitution, Article 3, and in the 1789 Judiciary Act and subsequently. So that's why the Supreme Court serves life terms. Now, one of the problems with this is when the good behavior idea was developed hundreds of years ago, people lived to be 30 or 40. So here's what the proposal is to save the courts. The one proposal from these former judges and Ivy League professors is we should move the Supreme Court to 15 members, 5 appointed by Republicans, 5 appointed by Democrats. The last 5 would be appointed by the 10 people serving on the bench. And these last 5 would come from the appellate courts. We have the Supreme Court, we have appellate courts, and we have district courts. So the appellate court is often, not always, but oftentimes sort of the grooming ground, if you will, for Supreme Court justices. Let's go ahead and move to the next slide. Another proposal is we keep it at 9, but we have rotating justices. They serve 1 year. So they're picked from the appellate courts 1 year, 1 year, 1 year. I like both these ideas because I think I'm generally opposed to term limits, by the way, even for the presidents and for Congress. Here's why I'm for them with the Supreme Court. I don't know that 9 people should decide what's constitutional. Also, since 1980, since Reagan's campaign and when he took office in 81, the average tenure of a Supreme Court justice is 29 years, everybody. And we've had several justices that have served 30 some years. The 3 Trump appointments were very young, the 40s. They could serve for decades and decades. So I just, no matter who is making the appointments, I just don't think it's democratic, small letter D democracy. One more here, I think, for this. Let's go ahead and move the slide to the next one. Okay, the other proposal was for term limits. What the federal judges and Ivy League profs are saying is 18 years on the bench. One other proposal is 15 years. I have always proposed 10 years. And since I'm giving the lecture, I thought I'd put my proposal in there. Okay, let's move on and see what's next. Just a picture of the justices sitting there. Yeah, there we go. Hello, all 9 of you. All right, next. All right, so I talked about the good behavior clause. Take a look there. Justice Douglas served 36 and a half years. As you can see, Justices Field, Black, and Stevens, over 34 years. So it's remarkable. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So in terms of healing, everybody, let me say a couple of things. So first off, incivility is not new. This partisanship is not new. I think it's worse than any time since the Civil War, but clearly not new. In our very first Congress as a nation, there was a melee in the Congress floor. It was like a world wrestling match or rugby scrum. A member named Matthew Lyons, Lyons, who ended up in Kentucky, spit in the face of a veteran named Roger Griswold, and they got into a fight. And Lyons's supporters went to the fireplace in the Congress, took the steel tongs out of the fireplace and desks and started attacking their opponents, Northern opponents, with it. So just ridiculous. Of course, we need to remember that Alexander Hamilton, the Treasury Secretary, and Aaron Burr, who was the sitting vice president in July of 1804, fought a duel. So incivility is not new. We've seen a number of cases of violence. Senator Charles Sumner in the 1850s, in the lead up to the Civil War, the great rhetorician and orator from Massachusetts, gave a legendary speech in 1856 in the Senate called Crimes Against Kansas. He was talking about the fact that there was slavery in the southern half and freedom in the northern half. And the question was, should Kansas come in as free or slave? It was symbolic because Kansas is the 50-yard line, north, south, east, and west, right in the middle of the country. And it's a big, large territory. It was combined at the time with Nebraska and even the Dakotas. So a massive parcel of land, fertile soil. And Northern pacifists and Quakers went out and preached the doctrine of abolition and love. The South emptied out their prisons, armed them, and they ran around killing Northerners. So this was just horrific. So Sumner called out the South and also called them out for a practice called night walking. Today we would call it rape, which happened against female slaves all the time. And a group of Southerners from South Carolina, led by a congressman named Preston Brooks, charge into the Senate chambers and with pistols hold the Senate hostage, while Brooks, with the steel-tipped cane, beats the daylights out of Senator Sumner, knocked him into a pool of blood unconscious under his desk, left him for dead. Sumner would live, but was never the same. So we've had a number of instances of this, but we've also had instances of civility, which we need to remember. You all probably, everybody knows of Dan Quayle and Ted Kennedy. That's an unlikely pairing, but the Kennedy-Quayle bill was to replace the old CETA. If anybody remembers the old Comprehensive Education and Training Act, was something called the JTPA, the Job Training Partnership Act. So Quayle and Kennedy co-sponsored bills. We had John McCain working with Russ Feingold. McCain of Arizona, Republican, Feingold of Wisconsin, a Democrat. McCain and Feingold co-sponsored campaign finance legislation. Years ago, I had a great honor. Former Senator and presidential nominee George McGovern was opening up his Center for Public Service, and his best friend and was keynoting the event, Bob Dole, former Republican senator and presidential nominee. And I was asked to convene this conference and ribbon cutting and all that. So I asked McGovern and Dole, I said, why don't the two of you sit on stage and share stories? And they said, no, you interview us. And I said, no, I'm just going to say, tell us some stories. That's what people really want to hear, where the rubber meets the road. These guys were best friends. And this is what they told me and told the audience. They said, sure, we would disagree on the Senate floor. Of course, McGovern's liberal, Dole's a conservative. But that night we go out for drinks. They said almost weekly, we invited Bob Byrd from West Virginia, Strom Thurmond from South Carolina, Jesse Helms from North Carolina, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, Ted Kennedy. I mean, talk about an unlikely group. But they said we were all good friends. We would go out for dinner, and over bourbon, we would solve the disagreement on the Senate floor and come up with a compromise. So it's all about meaningful relationships, which we simply don't seem to have. Former Republican Senator and Republican leader Trent Lott of Mississippi always says now that the problem is that there's just no relationships in Washington. It's all about scoring political points. Olympia Snowe, the former Republican senator from Maine, who was a moderate, echoes that, saying that, even if you talk to someone across the aisle these days, you're labeled disloyal or an enemy. We have to get together and realize we may disagree, but we're all Americans. So we need to get back to that Dole McGovern sense of civility. And I'll end with just a couple quick observations. This is not the first time this nation has been challenged with the idea of healing. George Washington devoted much of his initial presidency, his 2 terms, to the idea of healing. Washington expressed great dismay and alarm that after the Revolutionary War, which would end in 1783, in those years up until he took office in 1789, he saw the rise of political factions, the Federalists and Anti-Federalists, disagreements between the North and the South, a huge fight over whether we should have a capital and then where it should be, parochialism. New York and Pennsylvania almost went to war with one another. We had, Shays' Rebellion. The country had really fallen apart after the war. So Washington devoted much of his presidency to healing. And his argument was that he was going to be the president of all the people and try to find that 50-yard line. Let me give 2 more examples. Lincoln, during the Civil War. After the Civil War, remember, the South started the war. Hundreds of thousands of Americans died. Millions were wounded. The South oftentimes stopped exchanging prisoners during the war. At one point, Nathan Bedford Forrest and other Southern generals just killed people as they tried to surrender. So in the North, a lot of people wanted blood, so to speak, revenge, vengeance. Lincoln offered compromises and conciliation. Lincoln, when his son Robert and Grant went to Appomattox Courthouse, he said, I don't want to see Lee in chains. He said, let them go. Tell them to take their horses and go home. Just as Washington pardoned everybody in the Philadelphia Mutiny, Shays' Rebellion, all these uprisings, Washington literally said, go home, and pardoned them. Lincoln repeated that. Lincoln's second inaugural address is known for its magnanimity and humanity. You know, Lincoln reminded everybody that both sides prayed to the same God. Both sides drew the sword and were willing to spill blood. Lincoln called for us to come together. Great magnanimity. And the third and final example, you all knew I had to say it at some point. Truman. You know, how can I give a lecture without mentioning Truman? My family is so sick of hearing about Harry Truman 7 days a week for their lifetimes. Anyways, at the end of World War II, Truman knew that this country needed healing. We had just been through the world's bloodiest war, 60 to 80 million people dead around the world. The world was destroyed. We just came through the world's most heinous example of genocide in the Holocaust. And of course, Truman, as we all know, promoted a homeland, Israel, in 1948, and brought in almost 400,000 Jews from DP camps at the end of the Holocaust. So, I mean, that's healing. But here's what Truman was pushing, what's sometimes called the Double V campaign, Double V. Truman desegregates the military and fights for healing at the end of the war. But this is what he said. You know, we were fighting for victory in Europe against fascism and for liberty and freedom. But the irony is, a lot of the people fighting in Europe, they came back home and couldn't sit at the same lunch counter. So Truman brilliantly calls out and identifies 4 groups of heroes. One, the Tuskegee Airmen, who flew 100 escort missions, the red-tailed angels, over European skies, escorting our B-17s, B-24, our bombers. Yet when they came home, you know, they were discriminated against. The second group he identified was the Navajo Code Talkers. These are the Native Americans and the Navajo Res, which is in northeastern Arizona. And the Germans and the Japanese were really, really sophisticated at encoding, decoding, encrypting, and decrypting the code. So what we did is we had the Navajos, which had an oral tradition, not a written language. And apparently Navajo is one of the more complicated languages. Had the great honor of interviewing some of these Navajo code talkers about 2 decades, 25 years ago, earlier in my career, 25. And here's what they would do. Let's say Rabbi Jessica is the general and I'm the lieutenant out in the field. Rabbi Jessica would have a Navajo with her. I'd have one with me. Rabbi Jessica would tell her Navajo what to tell me. Then that guy would tell the Navajo talking to me. And the Japanese, if they listened in, they didn't know what on earth we were saying. So these people served bravely, yet they were discriminated against. Third, the Japanese Americans of the legendary Go for Broke, that's the 442nd. They suffered some among the highest casualties of World War II and were about the most decorated unit. Yet those Japanese Americans were discriminated when they went back home. I taught at the University of Hawaii, and I had a chance to interview some of these guys when I was there 20 years ago. And, you know, they were trying to get jobs on the docks and they wanted decent wages. And the government called out the police and military and they opened fire on these World War II heroes in the city of Hilo. It's called the Hilo Massacre. And the fourth and final group Harry called out, Jewish Americans, who knew if they were caught by the Nazis, their treatment would not be what non-Jews would receive. And yet, so what we needed was a double V. We needed victory at home against fascism, but we needed victory at home for rights and equality. So it's been done before, everybody. We need to rise up as a nation, not let these differences, these arbitrary differences, you know, Rabbi Jessica, Rabbi Levin and I, Rabbi Weissman and I, we don't agree on everything, I'm sure, but we could find the 50-yard line and we could see one another as friends, as fellow Americans, and we need to have that spirit. So I encourage all of you, do not let political differences ruin relationships, business, personal, otherwise, especially as we go into the holidays. We've done it before. We as a nation can have a mandate and a call to arms, so to speak, for a renewal and a sense of healing. Thank you very much. Shabbat Shalom. It's a real pleasure and honor to again be with you, and I look forward to coming out in person again.
Dr. Watson, as always, it's an honor and a pleasure to hear from you, have you with us. It always feels like, whether in this format or when you're with us in person, we are in the room where it happens, understanding the lessons of history and how they help us go forward. I can't thank you enough for devoting time with us today. We pray that you stay safe and well. And thank you so much for joining this Shabbat. We remind everyone that next Friday night we'll celebrate Hanukkah together, the festival of light in this darkest of days. To come together in joy and light will be something wonderful. We want to wish everyone a Shabbat Shalom. We want to thank all our producers and thank you for joining us tonight for services. And thank you again, Dr. Watson. Shabbat Shalom.